What was the cause of the United States Civil War?
Well, don't come with an easy question or anything. I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do. What do you think the cause of the Civil War was? I'm sorry?
I'm not running for president. I wanted to see your
That's a good thing.
On the cause of the Civil War.
I mean, I think it always comes down to the role of government and what the rights of the people are. And I will always stand by the fact that I think government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people. It was never meant to be all things to all people. Government doesn't need to tell you how to live your life. They don't need to tell you what you can and can't do. They don't need to be a part of your life. They need to make sure that you have freedom. We need to have capitalism. We need to have economic freedom. We need to make sure that we do all things so that individuals have the liberties so that they can have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do or be anything they want to be without government getting in the way.
Thank you. And in the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you answer that question without mentioning the word slavery.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
No.
So there you have Nikki Haley, who's running for president, the former governor of South Carolina, explaining why she thought that slavery wasn't the main cause of the Civil War. Now, Nikki Haley has received a lot of backlash for the answer. So much so to the point that she had to do a mea culpa and clarify what exactly she meant.
They have been all a chatter today about something that happened at a town hall last night in Berlin. And so I want to go ahead and address that before I address you in the town hall. Last night I was asked about the Civil War. And what I think of the Civil War, what was the cause of the Civil War? Of course, the Civil War was about slavery. We know that. That's unquestioned, always the case. We know the Civil War was about slavery. But it was also more than that. It was about the freedoms of every individual. It was about the role of government. For 80 years, America had the decision and the moral question of whether slavery was a good thing and whether government, economically, culturally, any other reasons, had a role to play in that. By the grace of God, we did the right thing and slavery is no more. But the lessons of what that bigger issue with the Civil War are is that let's not forget what came out of that, which is government's role, individual liberties, freedom for every single person, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do and be anything you want to be without anyone or government getting in your way. That should be the goal of what we always try and take away from that, right?
So as you see there, she did her best to clarify her answer when it came to slavery being the cause of the Civil War or slavery being the main reason for the Civil War. So we're going to go down the rabbit hole that I went down recently related to this, because just like everybody else, I thought slavery was the main reason for the Civil War. Growing up in Mississippi in the Deep South, we've heard all the stories related to the Confederacy, the secession from the Union. I mean, I've been to Vicksburg. I've seen all the historic battles where the Battle of Vicksburg took place. I mean, I've seen all those places, not just in Mississippi, but throughout the South. And so I was always working under the assumption that, yes, of course, the Civil War is all about slavery. That's what it was about. There could be nothing else that the Civil War was about. But once I heard Nikki Haley say that, and I started to actually dig into, I was surprised. I really, really was. So I want to share this information and get ready. Don't lose your patriotism. once you see the information, I'll share all the links to all the articles and things I've come across in the description. And one thing I want to point out is that people of good faith on both sides have missed it on this issue. People of good faith. Now, you do have those people who want to keep race in the forefront of America. They keep pushing this narrative that America is systemically racist. They keep pushing this because they want to divide America and want to keep us separated. But that is another reason, too, why there was a civil war. You have to understand, whenever you see people pushing an agenda, it's related to power, and behind power is related to money. It's the finances of it. That is what people are literally trying to push. So whenever you see these race, and as Black people, we got to stop being so sensitive and stop being fixated on this slavery issue. Because when you dig deeper, it's much more than just slavery in terms of what has been used to keep people separated that had different skin tones. It's much more than just slavery. Slavery happened. Racism was real. Yes, I'm not denying any of that. I'm not denying that the Confederacy did want to keep slavery. That was a main reason. I'm not denying the fact that President Abraham Lincoln was an anti-slavery candidate, but he also was a candidate that wanted to promote the tariffs. And the tariffs were the starting point as to why the South wanted to secede from the North and wanted to start the Confederacy. So let me show you this first article here. So I came across this article talking about how taxes caused the Civil War. And immediately I was like, no, that can't be true. But then when you think through it, you understand the history of the tariffs. How, for example, the North didn't have to pay as much as the South when it came to tariffs because the South was more of an agrarian economy. I mean, they produced tobacco and cotton, and they exported a lot of those things. And so therefore, the South had to carry the burden of a number of the tariffs. The first one was called the Black Tariff. It was created to repay the national debt after the War of 1812. Because you have to understand something. Whenever there's war, the war has to be financed, right? And don't think about the current structure of America when it comes to the banking system and central bank and all of those things. That did not exist at this time. You have to understand something. That did not exist. So you have to raise money a certain way. And so this tariff was instituted. It created a favorable situation for the North because they benefited from the high taxes. The South produced and exported most of the goods in America, and under the tariff, that resulted in the South paying about 75% of all the taxes in America. So you had states like Georgia, states like North Carolina and Virginia paying a larger share of taxes than those states in the North. Now, wouldn't that make them upset, right? And it also prevented them from buying European imports because after the taxes were collected, they were too costly. This meant the South's only option was to buy from the North. The South's money was ending up. Now, when I go through this, I'm not justifying what the South did, okay? I want to make sure that's clear. Slavery was reprehensible and abominable. Let's make that clear. I'm not justifying anything that the South did. I'm just explaining the thinking behind it. And it wasn't just about slavery. And so therefore, this started the seeds of resentment in the South. And then President Andrew Jackson, a Democrat, was able to reduce some of the taxes on the South in the Great Compromise of 1833. See, Andrew Jackson actually ended the first attempt at a central bank. Andrew Jackson actually decentralized the banking system in America. He opened the door to fractional banking. And while that helped certain people, it harmed other people. And what that did, it caused a disparate system, meaning that Georgia will have a separate currency than Mississippi, and Mississippi will have a separate currency than Alabama. And even within certain districts, you will have different currency. And it was tough for people to keep track of that. But that's how things were back at this time. See that Lincoln did not campaign against slavery. Now, President Lincoln was against slavery. He was an abolitionist. He listened at the feet of John Adams. He was an abolitionist. Don't get me wrong, but he wanted to preserve the Union more than he did to stop the practice of slavery. And I'll explain that more in a second. See, he had support in the North. And you see, while he was morally opposed to slavery, stating years earlier that slavery was an unqualified evil to the Negro, the white man, and the state, but he knew he was a politician too. He knew that was not going to win him the presidency. So he repeatedly had no intention to challenge slavery. He did champion a return to the high import taxes to help his constituency in the North. You see, this President Lincoln, he said this: I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in states where it exists. What he wanted to do, he wanted to keep slavery confined to the states where it existed. He did not want that peculiar institution to spread westward, whereas the Confederate states wanted to spread that westward. I mean, that's why I have all the Missouri, all these compromises that I don't have time to really go into, that we really need to delve into probably in the future. But that was another contributing factor to the secession from the southern states. This is something that a lot of us have not even heard of. I had not heard of this before recently. And this is a Corwin Amendment. And you ask me, so what do you mean? What's the Corwin Amendment? The Corwin Amendment was an amendment that was written by Representative Thomas Corwin of Ohio to protect slavery. Yes. Oh, yes. And President Lincoln championed this because President Lincoln wanted to keep the Union intact, because you have to understand something. There were outside forces, France, Britain. They wanted to keep the states separate with the ultimate goal of dissolving the United States and them getting a return back from the investment they had made when they sold for example, France, when they sold the Louisiana Purchase, when they sold that portion of land to the United States. And of course, Britain wanted to get back their original colonies. And so there were central banks in these countries were actually profiting off of the war that was taking place in the United States. And they wanted to see the United States destroyed. And so President Lincoln didn't want that. And so therefore he championed this Corwin Amendment. And here's what the amendment said. This was going to be the 13th Amendment. The original 13th, not the one they would have now. This was going to be the 13th Amendment if it was ratified. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give the Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. In other words, slavery is going to be enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. Let that sink in. Slavery was going to be enshrined into the U.S. Constitution. I know there, on a side note, there have been battles within certain states like Ohio when people wanted to enshrine abortion and have enshrined abortion into their constitution. Well, over 160 some odd years ago, slavery was going to be enshrined into the U.S. Constitution. And this is the amendment. The House approved Corwin's amendment. He just needed the 2/3 threshold, and he got it. And then the Senate took it up. So when President Lincoln took over on March the 4th, he sent the proposed amendment to the states for ratification. Now, not enough states ratified it because it failed to stop the secession by the South. But this was something that was going to be enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. But now, if you look at the 13th Amendment that was enshrined in the Constitution, and if you read it closely, you see that it actually called for, or allowed rather, the indentured servitude of people convicted of a crime. Listen closely. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So if the Civil War was all about the emancipation of the slaves, right, was all about giving black people freedom, why did the 13th Amendment have that out clause? Except as a punishment for crime. Do you know a lot of southern states utilize that to accuse and convict black people of crimes that they had not committed in order to keep them in servitude, in slavery? They did. That's why you have to have the 14th and 15th Amendment right after that. Think about that for a second. And you see, even Charles Dickens talked about how the northern onslaught upon slavery was no more than a piece of specious humbug designed to conceal its desire for economic control of the southern states. What I want to communicate is all about money and power. Genesis, the nexus, the crux of it was about money and power and which area would have it. That was the cause of it. The South was tired of paying these high taxes, these high tariffs rather, to the North and having to buy from the North because the North was profiting off of the high tariffs that the South was paying. It was big government. Big government was causing the southern states to become indebted to the North, and the southern states were tired of it. That's the reason. You see in Lincoln's first inaugural address, he made no mention of ending slavery, but he did promise to collect high taxes on imports in the South under all circumstances and without exception. And you see the Southerners were fed up. Now, I will say this again, just to reiterate, because I know people hear portions of this video and think that I'm justifying slavery. No, that's the furthest thing from the truth. There's no justification of slavery at all. I'm just explaining the mindset of the Southerners. I know about the cornerstone speech by Alexander Stevenson, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, how he talked about the peculiar institution, how he talked about how the Negro race was always going to be subservient to the white race. I get all that. So I know they were racist. I know what they were thinking. I know why they wanted to preserve their rights to have and own black folks. I get that. But it was in conjunction with the high tariffs and things that the North had placed on them as well as being part of this United States. You have to understand something. At the beginning of the Civil War, the South was dominating the North. The North was struggling, and Lincoln knew he had to keep the Union together. And so that's when he started down the path of the Emancipation Proclamation, because he wanted to, number one, galvanize the North around an issue that will bring more and more people to fight, which of course was slavery, because that is a moral issue. That was a moral issue of the day. And two, President Lincoln needed soldiers. And so by emancipating the slaves in the South, he had new reinforcements to come in and help fight for the North. And if you have not seen the movie Glory, I highly recommend you watch that, because you'll see that just because the North, that movie shows you right there that the North, the soldiers in the North weren't just about slavery, about emancipating the black people. You understand? They weren't just fighting for black people. They weren't, because those soldiers experienced racism fighting for the North. So let's keep that real, okay? Racism existed in both the North and the South. We have this notion, we've been told in our textbooks, because you have to understand something. History is written by the winners. And so we have been told and painted this picture that the North was altruistic, that they were all the good guys. No, in this case, there were no good guys. Bro, there are no good guys. The Bible talks about there is only one good, and that is God. You have to understand the heart of man. The heart of man is evil. And so, no, the North were not the good guys. And it's not saying the South were the good guys either. There were no good guys in war. And so President Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation, and that helped to change the Civil War. But you have to understand something. You know how I mentioned earlier how the 13th Amendment that was passed and ratified had language in it that could call for slavery if someone was convicted of a crime? You know, the most common crime that blacks were charged with was vagrancy. Yeah, or simply being unemployed. Slavery was rebranded as convict leasing and remained prevalent through the South for decades. And you see, this practice became so common that in 1898, over 30 years after the supposed end of slavery, over 70% of the revenue in the state of Alabama came from the labor of these men labeled as convicts. Crazy. And another thing too, President Lincoln needed to raise money. He needed to raise money because war is expensive, and people that have the financing and people that finance the war control the purse strings. They're the ones that can dictate to politicians, just like today, these special interests dictate to politicians as to what policies and things they want to do. And in this case, back at this time, it was the central banks in Europe that were financing a lot of the stuff that was happening. They were financing the South in a number of ways through the export and through the purchase of goods. And so President Lincoln needed a way to raise money to help the war effort. And so what President Lincoln did was to enact the National Bank Act of 1863. And so what this did, this had three objectives: to create a market for war bonds, to reestablish the central banking system destroyed during President Andrew Jackson's administration, and to develop a stable bank note currency. Now, this was not a central bank as we have today. This was going to be a bank created by the government. See, today, the Federal Reserve is not a part of the government. It's not subjected to the government. It is outside the government. As a matter of fact, the government reports to the Federal Reserve. But what President Lincoln wanted to do was to have a central bank Federal Reserve type of structure or concept to where the government would charter banks, but ultimately the banks were beholden to the government. You have to understand, instead of the government beholden to the banks, because once the government has become beholden to the banks, our republic no longer exists. And it does not, because our government is beholden to the Federal Reserve. So President Lincoln had to do this to raise money. That's where you see the term greenbacks and those kind of things that were established during this time, and the establishment of the dollar, which we have come to become familiar with and accustomed and with today. That was started during this National Bank Act of 1863. All these things happened during this time. As you can see, the cause of the Civil War was much more than slavery. Slavery had a large part. Yes, it did, because that propelled the economy of the South. It did. And the Southerners, with some of their racist tendencies and racist ideologies, wanted to keep that going. But at the same time, abolition of slavery was not initially the main thrust of the North and President Lincoln. His main thrust was keeping the Union together. And he just so happened to pivot to the abolition of slavery in order to galvanize support in the North and to get new soldiers from the recently emancipated slaves. There you go. So while Nikki Haley inartfully answered that question and did not fully explain it in a way that she should, and especially in today's climate, when you have race hustlers who are looking to pounce on anything when somebody says that they see as outside of the norm when it comes to slavery and it comes to race and those kind of things, she was not fully wrong. People in this world want us to be victims. This educational system has victimized us to not know the full scope of history. We're not victims. We are empowered for greatness. To see more about Jekyll Island, watch this video.